Funding for Firing Line is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you and by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Mobile Corporation, Farley Industries, Incorporated, Monarch Financial Services, Incorporated, Payne Weber, and the Friends of Firing Line.
From Boston University, welcome to Firing Line. I'm Michael Kinsley of the New Republic magazine. Picture the scene. It belongs in the movies, or perhaps on Masterpiece Theater. We are at the third or fourth meeting between the new brash young President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, and the elderly aristocratic Prime Minister of Great Britain, Harold Macmillan. The subject is supposed to be nuclear arms, but in the middle of the discussion, Kennedy suddenly turns to Macmillan and says, "I wonder how it is with you, Harold. If I don't have a woman for 3 days, I get a terrible headache." That anecdote comes from the second and final volume of Alistair Horne's magisterial official biography of Macmillan, which has just been published in the United States. I was living in England when the book came out there last spring, and some of the local critics expressed skepticism about that story, which made headlines in the British press. Mr. Horne says the source is an unrecorded conversation between himself and Macmillan. Americans, accustomed by now to this kind of Kennedy anecdotage, may find it a little less hard to believe. At any rate, Mr. Buckley has here today both Mr. Horne and Professor Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., the chief keeper of the Kennedy flame, so we'll have the truth or at least a good fight about this shortly. This is the second of 2 shows about the special relationship between America and Britain in general and between Kennedy and Macmillan in particular. Alistair Horne is the author of 14 books of history. Probably the best known until now is The Savage War of Peace, about the Algerian War of Independence from France. Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., frequent firing line pugilist, author of books beyond number, some of which are not about the Kennedys, is the Albert Schweitzer Professor of Humanities at the City University of New York. And to give the Kennedy side an unfair advantage, we also have Professor John Kenneth Galbraith of Harvard. Mr. Buckley, this anecdote takes up about 7 lines in a book of 739 pages, but it has gotten an awful lot of attention, and I suppose we ought to settle it once and for all. Is it true, and does it matter?
Well, I think we should turn to a historian to ask whether it's true.
I'm sure that this is what Harold Macmillan said to Alistair Horne, because Alistair Horne is a first-class historian and biographer and a man of utmost probity. Okay. Whether John Kennedy ever said it to Harold Macmillan is something I have great skepticism about, because Kennedy, among other things, was a man of great courtesy, a great respect for Macmillan, great respect for older men in general. It seems to be quite unlikely, improbable, out of character for him to have said this to a British Prime Minister, a man whom he hardly knew, and a man who was a generation older. I think one must remember about Harold Macmillan that he was, in a certain sense, Victorian rather than Edwardian in his own personal morals. He had a deep tragedy in his life, which Alistair Horne writes about with great tact and sensitivity, and that is the fact that his own wife had been notoriously unfaithful to him and had a lover, and the love affair was persisted during her whole life. And I think for various reasons, Macmillan had hang-ups of one sort or another about this. He remembered something of this sort, but I personally am very skeptical. I share the skepticism expressed in the some of the British comment that Kennedy ever said anything like that to Macmillan.
To touch on just one point Mr. Schlesinger makes, Mr. Horne, wasn't it a surprise to Mr. Macmillan that in his first meeting with John Kennedy, he showed a kind of spontaneity which he simply didn't anticipate? This isn't to document or to challenge the question whether he did or didn't say it, merely that it would not have been an unsayable thing for that particular reason.
I don't think it was unsayable. First of all, I'd like to get back there. I was quite surprised when the British press took this up at such length in England, but even more surprised that such an august body, the New Republic, should be so interested in what is really, in the United States, a throwaway line. But Macmillan was apparently aware of these activities of Kennedy at a very early stage, and I found a remark he'd made in his diary, actually before the election, talking to the ex-American ambassador Jock Whitney, who he says in his diary, Kennedy must be a strange character, obstinate, sensitive, ruthless, and highly sexed. Now, he was not unaware, as a lot of us were unaware at the time, but I agree that I think the remark is very unlikely, very strange. Of course, it would have been a great deal more unlikely if, for instance, Harry Truman had said this to him. But I just have to say, and I'm flattered by Mr. Sessions' remark about my probity, that I did record this in all fidelity at one of Macmillan's.
Well, let's ask a broader question, which, among other things, gives us the advantage of getting off that particular theme. Right. You were in close quarters with Harold Macmillan writing this book for 9 years, right? 7 years, during which you spent a great deal of time with him. To what extent was he capable of jocularities, of historical significance of this order?
Well, very much so. In fact, in the Kennedy context, I remember being very shocked by on one occasion he had talked at great length what Kennedy meant to him, and very movingly, and talked about the last time they met, the helicopter taking off from Birch Grove and the hope of the young world departing, and I was reduced to tears almost. The next day he made a remark rather like this, and I was quite shaken. I said, I reproved him on this point, and he said, "Dear boy, you must remember, in public life as well as political life, there must never be too sharp a distinction between what is frivolous and what is serious." And I think this is very much the essence of Macmillan's whole attitude towards politics and towards life. And
yes, but I think that's a poetic point that, for instance, Shakespeare dramatizes par excellence. But are we to read your book on the understanding that some of the quotations given to you have to be weighed as to their probability?
Well, I think, to go back to this one specifically, I did make a remark afterwards that it should be taken in context, and it did not represent Macmillan's settled view of Kennedy. And the only reason I mentioned it in this book, and that's why I'm a little bit aggrieved to be so played up, was because it was to illustrate how very deep and how very profound the attachment of Macmillan and his respect for Kennedy was, and that despite this aspect of Kennedy's life, which of course he rather disapproved. That was really the point I was trying to bring over.
In other words, you wanted examples of the kind of thing that Macmillan was offended by in order to demonstrate all the more captivatingly the transcendence of those weaknesses.
Precisely, yes.
Could you put that any better, Mr. Galbraith?
This is an episode on which I'm delighted to say I have no position whatever. In substantial measure, I recommend that ignorance to almost everybody else.
Well, if we want to stick to matters by which you're ignorant, should we talk about economics? I think it's very interesting.
Are you playing to applause as usual?
I think it's very interesting that Mr. Horne paid so much attention to the utter trauma suffered by Macmillan when de Gaulle finally said, no, you can't join the EEC. And it was raised at our first session whether this special relationship might have motivated de Gaulle. So I think it would be interesting to hear you analyze whether the delay in entering the EEC in fact hurt Britain economically, or was it merely the socialist prime ministers?
Well, to answer without and ignore, as I usually do, the underlying implication of the question, something I recommend to larger audiences. There was bound to be difficulty about the entry of Britain into the EEC. And there were questions on the British side as to the wisdom at that time, because the post-war recovery of Britain had required a very substantial measure of state control. That was something that had to come from London and a non-existent government in Brussels, so that this should have been a subject of debate in Britain was not at all surprising, and there should have been concerns on the part of Macmillan, as on the part of many others, is not surprising. And the British tradition of economics, the British tradition of the British sense of economic superiority,
and nationalism.
Was something that was bound to look troublesome to de Gaulle and to France. So perhaps the surprising thing is that the entry of Britain to the EEC came as soon as it did.
Well, when it did come...
Just one other word. At that time, I was never deeply involved with those matters, but I did know Jean Monnet very well. And I think it's fair to say that Monnet, when he envisaged the EEC, was at times inclined to think of it as something separate and different from an organization that included Britain. Would you think that possible?
Well, let me ask you this, Mr. Galbraith. When they did finally join, there was a great national debate. It did have the kind of discussion that you referred to as absent from any consideration at the time that Macmillan was so nervous about it. Is it your judgment that the opponents of England's entry into the EEC have been vindicated or not?
Oh no, I don't. I would have said that in the overall context, which includes military matters and which includes cultural matters, which goes far beyond economics, that the people who wanted to bring Britain into the EEC have been vindicated, have been justified. But I think there was a question of timing. I would not have, had I been active in Britain at the time, speaking actively, wanted to have seen that, say, as early as the 1940s or the early 1950s. There was a time when working away from the war, food shortages, currency shortages, the other terrible problems of post-war readjustment, when you needed the strong influence of an effective national government.
Well, I think we certainly missed the boat on, I would like to have seen Britain come into Europe in 1963 at the latest, and I do criticize Macmillan strongly in my book for having been very dilatory over this. But he had some of the factors we still see in Britain today, and you talk about nationalism. It's very, very strong. And it took him a long time to get the Tory party and public opinion behind him to go in, all of which, of course, was, as far as de Gaulle was concerned, was lost time. I think the other factor, and this is rather appropriate now with the German problem coming up, Macmillan was wounded 5 times in the First World War. He went all through the Second World War as Churchill's advisor to Eisenhower, and it did leave him with a certain vestigial suspicion about Germans, which he could never quite get over. And I think that he on this score, he was perhaps influenced to get Adenauer quite wrong. And this is a mistake, because Adenauer could have played an essential role in tipping de Gaulle towards British entry.
Could I ask a question to one of my oldest and most admired friends?
Sure, I'm free. I'm here.
What justification as a historian and a brilliant historian do you have for bringing your own personal criticisms to bear on the subjects that you are discussing?
Well, how should I answer that?
I hope you wouldn't be able to.
Well, I was going to fire one back at you, if I may, Professor Galbraith. I read in the British press last week that you had been caused to comment on the events in Germany, And you said it wasn't a matter of economics, it was a matter of emotion. But I've always thought the East Germans were one of your best clients.
I have no doubt about that. I can defend my position even though you can't. The overwhelming desire of the East Germans, well, they certainly wanted more consumers' goods, there was no question about that, but the overwhelming motivation was the extraordinary number of people in the mature industrial society who want to speak out and be heard. There are just more of them than you can keep quiet, and that this is, it was to this I was referring.
To go back to your question about the position of a biographer there, do you not think that a biographer should be allowed occasionally to be critical of his subject?
It's never stopped Mr. Schlesinger.
I would say I would absolutely defend the historian's right of assessment. In fact, what's the point of writing things unless you try to sit in some sort of judgment? The whole act of writing implies interpretation. Interpretation implies judgment, implies assessment. I think a historian who doesn't look at the person who, or administration or whatever he's writing about and say they seem right here and wrong there isn't fully doing his job.
He was talking about personal criticism, his interjecting his personal views. You never did that when you were writing about Roosevelt.
He had only his personal views. No, but he's actually serious, and I'm not sure I follow him, so I want to follow you. You don't find it, so to speak, unfaithful as a historian to proceed, having written about a historical episode, to discuss aspects of it which you didn't discuss in your book, or to be critical in a sense that you weren't in your book. You feel perfectly free to do that, don't you?
I feel perfectly free to do it in the book.
Sure. But even if you didn't do it in the book, you have no problem about extending that criticism later on. Well, put it this way: did you think that it was in some sense bad-mannered of Alistair Horne to volunteer his evaluation?
I thought not of Macmillan and the common market, or Macmillan in Germany. Certainly not. No, I would think that would be absolutely the kind of comment. After all, if a historian immerses himself in a period or in the life of a man, knows more about it than anyone else, and comes out of that with certain conclusions, I think he owes it to his readership to express the conclusions, not in the sense of personal whim or prejudice, but as arising from the evidence he has accumulated and analyzed.
Well, I don't recall in the book actually saying that I personally was in favor of British entry into the common market.
You didn't?
But I just mentioned this in the context of our debate today.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's perfectly legitimate for Alistair to say that Harold Macmillan's anti-German prejudices, understandable anti-German prejudices, may have meant that he did not use Adenauer as effective as he might to promote his own case.
Well, that's a question of fact. What I'm saying is that there should be, on the part of any historian, a measure of judicial detachment, which pictures the subject, but doesn't get down in the arena and struggle with him.
Well, most of the British press accuse him of not entering into the arena enough. How can you win?
Well, let me ask you this.
By always agreeing with me.
Well, I agree.
The question, a point you make is that to the extent that there was slippage in the constituency of Harold Macmillan, it was widely acknowledged that the reason for it was that his preoccupation with foreign affairs was such that he neglected domestic affairs. I wish he'd neglected them more, by the way. Under those circumstances, his concern with the EEC, for instance, might have not have gotten the kind of attention that he would otherwise have given it. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, I'd like to go on from that and ask Professor Galbraith, as I'm not allowed to express a view. Well, do you think...
Oh, no, I'm not. I'm allowing you to express a view, but I'm...
Well, do you think it's true, do you think it's fair, the criticism from the Thatcher wing of the Tory party, that Macmillan was the villain of the piece who opened the door to inflation and all the gremlins we've suffered since? Do you think that's fair?
Oh, it's within the, within what we would call the privileges of the First Amendment, but under, under that privilege, many, many ridiculous things are said, and this would be a prime example.
His problem was nobody had told him about voodoo economics, wasn't it?
Beg pardon?
His problem was nobody had introduced him to voodoo economics.
I'm delighted to hear this from you, Bill.
Well, you say you were just saying earlier that the first book you ever reviewed was The Middle Way.
I was doing it as a reviewer, not as a historian.
What did you think of the middle way?
Yes.
Harold Macmillan, under this languid Tory aristocratic pose, was in fact, in the terms of the British Conservative Party, on the left. He came from a district and constituency which had a high degree of unemployment during the Depression. He was the first Keynesian in the Conservative Party. For a time, even the thought passed through his mind that he might cross the aisles and join the Socialist Party. He wrote a book called The Middle Way, which, as Alistair Horne describes, he later, in his typical this manner of self-disdain, said it was a very boring book. But it was a quite interesting book, and you, Kenneth, say you reviewed that book. What did you say about it?
I reviewed it.
It's 1938 or 9.
1938 or 9, and I, first of all, it was the first book I ever reviewed, and I was enthralled that somebody would think that I should review a book by Macmillan. So I couldn't possibly, in that context, be violently critical. But the further fact was that I thought it was just an admirable exercise in pragmatism. I had already begun to feel...
What? Sorry?
I had already begun to feel that at that time, unlike you, Bill, that it was necessary to escape from confining ideology and resort to thought. And I pictured this book.
But haven't you given up trying to thinking after all this time?
I pictured this book as an example of that, and approved of it mightily.
Well, just to put a little bit back on the track, because I think we raised an interesting point. The hostility that he felt towards de Gaulle obviously had nothing to do with the First World War, but your portraits as rendered by Macmillan of de Gaulle are as severe as anything I've ever seen about any modern statesman.
Had to do with the Second World War.
Had to do
Where Macmillan...
Sure, that's absolutely correct.
Well, I think he had reason to
he said he never listens, for instance, that he's totally autocratic,
yes.
that his most recent re-election was so triumphant that he treated everybody else as minions, and that he was always more or less hinting at how he despised the Anglo-American alliance.
It has to be said, of course, that Macmillan probably did more than any single person in the entourage at the time to save de Gaulle's bacon in North Africa during the war, again and again and again against Churchill and Roosevelt. So I suppose he could be understood. Macmillan did feel there was a bitter piece of ingratitude of de Gaulle's part, but he never held it against him. He always used to say, long after 1963, this terrible rebuff that it was, he always used to say, "Now, I admire de Gaulle for his courage." And he never held it against him.
Well, he certainly held against him what he considered to be an irrational hostility.
Well, I don't think he realized quite how hostile de Gaulle was going to be until the last minute. This may have been where Macmillan's pragmatism let him down.
Well, let me ask Professor Galbraith this. In terms of 1992, is the hesitation of Mrs. Thatcher realistic, or is it provincial?
Well, I wouldn't describe it as either, Bill. I would say there are certain things that will remain with the sovereign government, including the budget, including the welfare system, including the particular attitudes toward particular industrial policies, and of course many other, the educational system, and that there is a case for this economic and cultural diversity, and that you can't entirely criticize somebody who wants to defend it. The other thing, not to make a long lecture of this, the other thing is that 1892 is exaggerated.
1992.
1992. Sorry, 100 years
George
off.
Bush.
I'm 100
Yeah,
years
1892
off.
is when Pearl Harbor was.
This is an enormous topic of conversation. And as so many things having to do with international trade and international affairs, they always look great in prospect, and they always look less in retrospect. We've heard an enormous comment in these last 2 or 3 years about the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. Now it's come, and in the next few years, nobody will notice the difference.
Thank you very much.
This is the end of the lecture.
This means time is up, so your lecture ended perfectly. Mr. Buckley, left and right in Britain today don't agree on very much, but one thing they do seem to agree on, the Thatcherites and the Laborites both, is that the Macmillan period was one of stultification and lost opportunity. Of course, they disagree about what exactly that lost opportunity was, but it does seem to have been undeniably the beginning of the period where everyone recognized that Britain was in decline. Now, having read Alistair Horne's book, and in light of that consensus, what is your evaluation of Macmillan's legacy, apart from the fact that he was this colorful old Edwardian?
Oh, well, Harold Macmillan in the book is spoken of very dramatically and with a great sense of appreciation as a huge historical figure. For instance, among other things, the most literate prime minister in the history of Great Britain. I tend to think that this book will make him remembered more for that than for anything he was able to affect as a prime minister. And in that same appraisal, it was said that he tried to govern as a conservative from left of center. I think he failed. I regret his failure, but it doesn't diminish from the grandeur of him as a human being.
Funding for Firing Line is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you and by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Mobile Corporation, Farley Industries, Incorporated, Monarch Financial Services, Incorporated, Payne Weber, and the Friends of Firing Line. This program was produced by Sika, which is solely responsible for its content. For a printed bound transcript of this program, send $3 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29250. Indicate the subject of the program, and please allow 3 weeks for delivery.
This is PBS.
William F. Buckley, Jr. offers 20 years of Firing Line guests from the 60s to the 80s. For $19.95, you can receive this companion book by calling 1-800-872-8642. Credit cards are acceptable. Or send a check to Firing Line, 2700 Cypress Street, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205.